He slid a cardboard box across his dining table and told me our mother's estate was mostly debt. 6 years I had fed her, bathed her, driven her to every appointment, and buried her. And my brother handed me a check for $3,500 and a box of what his wife called her trash. 6 weeks later, he sold our mother's house for $585,000. I know the exact number because I found the deed myself. Today, I check the paperwork of executors for a living. The county pays me to audit the math of men, exactly like my brother. And here is the part he still cannot live with. In that cardboard box, underneath the recipe tin and the photographs, was a stack of 99-cent composition notebooks. He thought he was handing me trash. He was handing me the whole case. So sit with me, and let's check his math together. My name is Nora Callahan. I am 51 years old, and I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, in a small brick house with a porch light I never turn off. You'll understand the porch light by the end. I tell this story the way I keep records, in order, in plain words, with the numbers attached. Because if you've ever been the one who stayed, the one who showed up while everyone else sent their love from a distance, then you already know how this story starts. You lived the first half of it yourself. If that is you, do one thing for me. Before we go on, type the word stayed in the comments. One word. I read every one of them, and I want to know how many of us there are. Now, I need you to hold one moment in your mind, because every single thing in this story happens either before it or after it. The moment is an afternoon, a Thursday, 2 p.m. My brother's dining table, that cardboard box sliding across the wood. That afternoon at his table is the center of everything. We will get there slowly, and we will leave it fast. 6 years before that afternoon at his table, my mother had a stroke on her kitchen floor in Maryville, Tennessee. Her name was June Callahan. She was 74 years old, a retired school cafeteria manager, a widow for a decade, and the kind of woman who wrote down every dollar she ever spent in a 99-cent composition notebook. From the drugstore, she had done it her whole life. Grocery ledgers, she called them. Milk, $1.89. Stamps, $11. Church, $20. When I was a girl, I asked her why she bothered, and she said the sentence I want you to remember, because this entire story balances on it. She said, if you don't write it down, it never happened. I found her on the floor a little after 5 p.m. on a Sunday, because Sunday was my day to bring groceries. The stroke took most of the strength on her left side, and some of her words. It did not take her mind. Not then. I want that on the record early. Not then. My brother Glenn arrived at the hospital. The next morning. Glenn is 3 years older than me. At the time, he was a loan officer at a regional bank over in Charlotte. The person who approves people's mortgages, which mattered to him a great deal, and will matter to this story even more. He came into that hospital room with a leather folder under his arm. And I remember thinking, who brings a folder to a stroke? Inside the folder was a power of attorney. That is a paper that lets one person sign for another, sign checks, move money, make decisions, all legally, all in the other person's name. Glenn had already filled it out. His name, in the blank. Spowen. He held the pen out to our mother's good hand and said it would make things easier. And then he turned to me and said the line he had been saying to me since I was 19 years old and overdrew a checking account by $12. He said, you are better at the hands-on stuff. Nora, let me handle this. You were always bad with money. You were always bad with money. Count how many times that sentence appears in this story. Then watch what happens to it at the end. I signed nothing, because there was nothing for me to sign. That was the arrangement made in 90 seconds in a hospital room. I would give my mother my hands, my hours, my Sundays, and then my weekdays, and then my nights. Glenn would give her his signature. He was right about one thing, though. Somebody in that family turned out to be very, very good with money. I just had the wrong somebody. For the first year, it worked the way these things work. I drove the 40 minutes from Knoxville to Maryville, 4 days a week, then 5, then 6. I learned the medication schedule. I learned the physical therapy exercises. I learned which pharmacist would take the time to explain things, and which one wouldn't. Mama got some words back. She got her right hand back, completely. On good days, we did the crossword, and she beat me to the answers. And every evening she would say, "Turn the porch light on." Nora, she had left that porch light on every night for 40 years, since before our father died. I asked her once, the way you ask about a habit, why it mattered so much. She looked at me like I'd asked, why doors have handles, so the ones I love can find the door. She said, hold on to that porch light. It comes back twice, and the last time it comes back, it will mean something different. A year after the stroke, 5 years before that afternoon, at his table, the money conversation happened. Glenn called me on a Tuesday night and told me Mama's savings were running low. Those were his words, running low. He said her retirement checks covered the house and the insurance, but the extras were adding up. And could I cover the day-to-day for a while? The groceries, the medications, the co-pays, the incontinence supplies. Nobody talks about the special shoes, the ramp for the back step. I said, yes, of course. I said yes. I was a bookkeeper for a heating and air company. And yes, I hear it too. The woman who is bad with money kept books for a living, but Glenn's stories never did survive contact with the facts. I made decent money, not good money. I had a small savings. I started spending it on my mother, and I did the thing my mother raised me to do. I bought a composition notebook, 99 cents, and I wrote it all down. Every receipt, hab, every date, every dollar. Not because I suspected anything. I want to be honest with you. I suspected nothing for years. But because June Callahan's daughter physically cannot spend money without writing it down, it is in my hands. It is how she made me. On the first page of the first notebook, I wrote her sentence, like an epigraph. If you don't write it down, it never happened. That was notebook 1. There would eventually be 5. Here is the incident from that year. I need you to keep. One afternoon that fall, I came in with groceries, and Mama was at the kitchen table, holding an envelope from her bank. She looked troubled. She held it out to me and said, Nora, look at this. This doesn't seem right. And before I could take it, Glenn came in from the hallway. I didn't even know. He was in town. He took the envelope out of her hand, easy as taking a plate, and folded it into his jacket, and smiled. Bank stuff, he said. I'll handle it. Don't worry, Nora, with it. You know she was always bad with money, and Mama laughed, because it was an old family joke by then. And I laughed, because what else do you do? That night, in the notebook, under the grocery totals, I wrote one line, letter from bank. Mama worried. Glenn took it. I didn't know what I was recording. I was just my mother's daughter, writing things down. Stay with me, because that one line, 9 words in a 99-cent notebook, gets read out loud in a courtroom before this story is over. The next 3 years, I'll give you honestly but quickly, because you already know their shape, the slow expansion of what I did, the slow shrinking of what Glenn did. His Sunday calls went to every other Sunday, then to holidays. His wife sent gift baskets with cheese in them. When he did visit, he'd walk the property like an appraiser, touching the fence, looking at the roof. And I remember exactly once he stood in the front yard looking at the house with his hands on his hips and said, more to himself than to me, "This land runs all the way to the creek, you know." I thought he was making conversation. Write that down, Nora. I didn't. The money in my notebooks climbed. It averaged out, over those years, to about $800 a month out of my own pocket. I'll do the arithmetic for you right now, so it is done. $800 a month for 5 years. $48,000. My notebooks put the true figure at $48,216. And I trust my notebooks. That is not a number. That is a down payment on a house I didn't buy. That is the retirement account I didn't fund. That is every trip I told myself I didn't really want to take anyway. And her savings were running low the whole time. Oh, how? Remember that. Her savings were running low. It was the reason for everything, and it came from Glenn. And I never once looked at a statement, because the man handling it approved mortgages for a living. And I was the one who was bad with money. If you've ever handed your trust to the family member with the confident voice and the good job, you know exactly how reasonable it felt. That is the thing nobody tells you about being robbed, slowly. It feels reasonable the entire time. Now we come to the Tuesday. 2 years before that afternoon, at his table. This is the hinge the whole story turns on, and I need you to see it exactly as I saw it, which is to say, without understanding it at all. That winter, Mama had started to change. Not her body. This time, her mind. She'd put the kettle on, and, forget it, she'd call me by her sister's name and correct herself. Embarrassed. In late February, I took her to a specialist. And on the first Monday in March, the letter came with the diagnosis: vascular dementia. Early stage, the letter said. But the word early is doing a lot of dishonest work in that sentence. What it meant was, there were now good days and bad days, and the bad days were going to win. The Tuesday I am talking about was March the 3rd, the day after that letter came. It was one of the bad days. She had been confused all morning. I know because I'd called at 9 a.m. and she couldn't hold on to what day it was. I got to the house at a few minutes past 4 p.m. As I turned onto her street, a gray sedan I didn't recognize was pulling away from her curb. In the kitchen, there were 2 coffee cups in the sink, one with lipstick on the rim in a shade my mother hadn't worn in years. A visitor's cup. There was a fresh ink smudge on the counter, blue-black, the kind a rubber stamp leaves. And my mother was sitting at the table with a pen still in her hand, pleased with herself, and she said, "I signed for the light bill, honey." Glenn said I had to sign for the light bill. Glenn's truck, it turned out, was parked around back. He came in from the yard easy and smiling, and said it was nothing. Insurance paperwork, a notary, all routine. A notary, if the word's new to you, is a licensed witness. A person with an official stamp, whose whole job is to certify that, yes, this exact person signed this exact person signed this exact paper in front of me, of their own free will. Their stamp is what makes a signature bulletproof. On a Tuesday afternoon, I said, she is having a bad day. Glenn, the letter just came, yesterday. And he put his hand on my shoulder. I can still feel the weight of it, and said, Nora, it is handled. You do the hands-on stuff. This is the paperwork side, and no offense, but I was always bad with money, I said. You said it, not me, he said. And he laughed, and he took the 2 coffee cups out of the sink and washed them himself. I had never once seen my brother wash a dish in my mother's house. That detail meant nothing to me. For 3 years, now, It is one of my favorite facts in the entire case file. That night, in Notebook 4, under the day's totals, I wrote the entry, and because it matters, I am going to give it to you word for word, exactly as it appears, because a judge would one day read it out loud in open court. Tuesday, March the 3rd. Mama confused all day. Couldn't keep the day of the week this morning. Doctor's letter came. Yesterday, a woman with a stamp was here when I arrived. Gray car. Mama says she signed for the light bill. Glenn says insurance. Glenn washed the cups. 39 words. I wrote them for the same reason. I wrote milk and stamps and copays, because if you don't write it down, it never happened. I closed the notebook and made dinner and thought about none of it. That detail is going to matter more than any other detail in this story. Don't lose it. I'll come back for it. I promise. The last 2 years before that afternoon at his table, I'll walk gently. Because she was my mother, and some of it belongs only to us. The disease did what the letter said it would. The good days thinned out. I dropped to part-time at the heating and air company, then took an unpaid leave that we both knew wasn't a leave. I moved into her spare room. Glenn visited 4 times in 2 years. I counted. Of course, I counted. Counting was all I had left of my own life. But I'll give you one good thing from that stretch, because the story deserves it, and so does she, even at the end, when whole rooms of her memory had gone dark. The porch light held. Every evening, whatever else she'd lost that day, she would look toward the front door around dusk and say, "Nora, the light." And I would turn it on, and she would settle. Whatever the disease took, it never found where she kept that, so the ones I love can find the door. She died in April, in her own bed, in the house her husband built, with my hand in her good hand. It was quiet. I had spent 6 years getting her to the only ending she'd ever asked for, and I wanted on the record that I don't regret one Sunday, $1, one night of it, whatever this story costs Glenn by the end. That part he can't touch. The funeral was on a Saturday. The house was full of casseroles and cousins, and at some point in the late afternoon, I looked up and saw my brother standing at the front door with his finger on the switch, turning off the porch light, in daylight, with the family still in the house. It is a small thing, I know, but you know those moments where a person shows you the next 10 years of your life in 1 second, and you feel it in your stomach before you can put words on it. It was that. He turned off her light, like a man, closing a register. To the cousins, all afternoon, he kept saying the same 3 words. He said, "It is all handled." 3 weeks later, I found out what handled meant, and now we are there. The 0 point, the afternoon, at his table. I am going to give it to you minute by minute, because I have replayed it minute by minute, more times than I can count. Thursday, 3 weeks after the funeral, Glenn asked me to come to his house outside Charlotte, a 3.5-hour drive he did not offer to make himself. To, in his words, settle Mom's affairs. I arrived at 1:54 p.m. I know, because I sat in the driveway for 6 minutes, so I wouldn't be early. His wife let me in, offered me sweet tea. I didn't take, and disappeared upstairs the way people disappear when they know what is scheduled. 2 p.m. Glenn, at the head of the dining table, a single manila folder in front of him, squared to the table's edge. Banker's posture. I'd seen him sit like that, across from strangers, his whole career. Now, the stranger was me. He opened the folder. He talked for 11 minutes. I mostly listened, which he took for agreement, because he had never once in 50 years watched me listen. The estate, he said, was mostly debt. That was the phrase delivered with a small, regretful shake of the head. He must have used 1,000 times. On mortgage applicants. Medical bills, he said. The equity line. He said, by the time it all washed out, he said, there was almost nothing. And honestly, Nora, we're lucky it wasn't worse. 2:13 p.m. He slid the check across the table. $3,500. He called it my share of what was left, and then, and I want you to hear the wording exactly, because wording is evidence, he said. I rounded it up for you, for everything you did, for her. He rounded it up for me. 6 years. On $48,216 of my own savings. Rounded up to 3,005. 2:14 p.m. I asked one question. I said, what about the house? And here it comes, the sentence he'd been building his whole life. He closed the folder. He said, the house was never part of the estate. Nora, Mom made arrangements. Years ago. It is handled. And then he smiled, the patient, banded smile of a man denying an application, and said, you wouldn't understand the paperwork. No offense. You were always bad with money. Here is what I did. Nothing. You could. Film. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. Hold that. We're counting my tears in this story. And the count is still 0. I stood up. I left the check on the table, and I watched something flicker behind his eyes when I did it. Because men like Glenn only know how to read people through money, and I had just gone illegible. I took the cardboard box his wife had packed. Her trash. I'd heard her call it through the kitchen door, the recipe tin, the photographs, and 5.99-cent composition notebooks that were mine anyway. Because I'd written every word in them, I took my key to Mama's house off my key ring, and I set the bare key on his dining table. And the only thing I said quietly, I said, write me down as handled. Then, I was in my car by 2:21 p.m. 19 minutes, start to finish, to settle 6 years. On the drive home, I did the one thing I regret, which is that I drove past her house. It was dusk. When I got to Maryville, the porch light was off. 40 years, and it was off. And the house sat there in the dark, like it didn't know us. I did not stop. I have not driven down that street again to this day, except once, at the very end of this story. And when I tell you about that time, you'll understand why it was different. I want to be honest with you about the next stretch, because this is the part of these stories that usually gets skipped. And the skipping is a lie. There was no montage feeling from the inside. I was 47 years old, out of savings, out of a job I'd let go of one careful piece at a time, and out of the 2 people, because I count the brother I thought I had, that my life had been organized around. If you have ever started over at an age when you were supposed to be settled, you know that the hardest part isn't the work, it is the arithmetic you do at 2 a.m. about how many working years you have left. That is the valley. I lived in it for a while. I am not going to walk you through the valley day by day, though. I am going to tell you about the door out of it, because the door had a person standing in it. 2 months after that afternoon at his table, I answered a county job posting in Knoxville. Records clerk, Register of Deeds office. The government office that keeps the permanent public record of who owns every piece of land in the county, every sale, every deed, every lien, going back more than a century. The pay was modest. I was overqualified in the ways that don't count, and underqualified in the ways that do. The woman who interviewed me was named Vera, 68 years old, 31 years in that office. Silver hair pinned up with an actual pencil, and the flattest, driest voice in East Tennessee. She looked at my application, looked at the 6-year gap in it, and said, "What did you do for 6 years?" I said, "I took care of my mother," she said. Then you can keep records, and hired me. It would be a long time before I understood how completely she meant it. Here is the rebuild, and I'll keep it moving, because you already know I survive. The question you are carrying is how a records clerk ends up auditing her own brother, and I promise you every step of the answer is boring, legal, and public, which is exactly why it worked. Year 1 after his table, I learned the records, not skimmed, learned. He, when defan, deeds, liens, plats, releases. I index them all day and read them on my lunch. Breaks the way other people read novels, because it turns out the county archive is nothing but novels. Marriages, debts, foreclosures, feuds. Vera would drop a 100-year-old deed book on my desk and say, page 412, a love story. And she'd be right. Year 2. I started night classes, paralegal certificate, with a concentration in probate. Probate being the court process that sorts out a dead person's property. The very process my brother had assured me there was no need for. I sat in a community college classroom 2 nights a week with people my daughter's age, if I'd had a daughter, and I took notes in composition notebooks. Because of course I did. 99 cents. Some habits are load-bearing. Somewhere in that second year, I told Vera the whole story. Late afternoon, the office empty, rain on the windows. I told it flat the way I've told it to you, and when I got to the end, the check, the key, the porch light off, I said, the thing that had been sitting on my chest since that afternoon at his table, I said, I can't prove any of it, Vera. It is his word against my memory, and everyone's always believed his word. Maybe I really don't understand the paperwork. Vera did not look up from her stamping. She squared the page, pressed the stamp, set it down, and said 5 words I will remember for the rest of my life. She said, people lie, Nora, paper waits. Then she looked at me over her glasses and added, and you work in the building where it waits. So, I want you to sit with that, the way I sat with it. People lie. Paper waits. Every deed my brother had ever touched was a public record, not hidden, not sealed. Public, meaning any citizen, any day, can walk into a records office, anywhere in this country, and read it. Paper doesn't get tired, doesn't get talked over, doesn't get told it was always bad with money. Paper just waits for someone to come read it. And I was becoming, 1 night class at a time, a professional reader. Year 3. The county probate court posted an opening for a probate examiner. That is the person who audits executors. When someone is put in charge of a dead person's estate, the examiner is the one who goes through their accounting line by line and makes sure every dollar went where the law says it must. The clerk of the court told me later why I got the job over 2 applicants with law degrees. She said my sample audit was the cleanest she'd seen in 20 years, and that I'd caught a $9 discrepancy the attorneys missed. $9. Somewhere, my mother closed a notebook and smiled. So that is who was sitting in the 3rd row of a continuing education seminar in the spring of year 3, a state-run training on what they call non-probate transfers, meaning all the ways property can pass outside a will. The instructor put a slide up and said 4 words that took the floor out from under me. Transfer on death deed. A transfer on death deed, and I am going to gloss this carefully, because this is the mechanism of the whole crime, is a paper a homeowner can sign that says, when I die, my house goes instantly and automatically to the person named here. No will. No court. No judge ever looks at it. The house just changes hands the moment. The heart stops. Perfectly legal. Genuinely useful for a lot of families. It only has to be signed by the owner, witnessed by a notary, and recorded at the Register of Deeds. Signed by the owner, Witnessed by a notary, a woman with a stamp, a gray car. I signed for the light bill. Honey, the instructor was still talking. I was sitting very still in the third row, and inside my head a Tuesday from 5 years earlier was assembling itself in a completely new order. And I heard my own voice from that kitchen. She is having a bad day, Glenn. The letter just came yesterday. And I thought, in these exact words, I know what the stamp bought. Here is what I did on my lunch break the next day. And I want to be precise about it, because this part matters to me. I did not use my position. I did not touch the court system. I did not need to. I walked to the public terminal in the lobby of the Register of Deeds, the same free terminal available to you, to anyone, no badge required. And I typed my mother's name into the index of Blount County land records, the same way any stranger could. 2 documents came back that I had never seen in my life. Stay with me now. This is where it changes. Document 1. A transfer, on death deed, on my mother's house, naming one beneficiary, Glenn Callahan, alone. Signed by June Callahan on March the 3rd, the Tuesday, notarized the same day, recorded that Friday, March the 6th. I stood at that public terminal and read the date maybe 10 times. March the 3rd. I didn't need to check my notebook. I knew what Notebook 4 said about March the 3rd, word for word, because I had written it. Mama confused. All day. Doctor's letter came yesterday. A woman with a stamp was here. From here on, I'll call this document what my attorney came to call it, what the whole case came to call it, the Tuesday deed. Document 2, a warranty deed. That is just the standard paper that transfers a house in an ordinary sale. Seller, Glenn Callahan. Buyer, a young couple whose names I won't use, because they did nothing wrong and they live there still. Recorded 6 weeks after my mother's funeral, and on the line where the county records the price, a number, $585,000. I am going to do this number for you, the way it hit me, standing in that lobby. 3 weeks after the funeral, my brother sat at his dining table and told me the estate was mostly debt and slid me a check for $3,500. 3 weeks after that, he sold the house he got by a deed our mother signed on the worst Tuesday of her diagnosis week, for $585,000. That check he rounded up for me was 0.6% of what he already knew the house would bring. Set the percent aside if numbers slide off you. Hear it this way instead. He gave me a used car. He kept a street. I printed both deeds at the public terminal. 40 cents a page. I paid cash at the counter, like any citizen, and Vera took my coins without a word, and I understood exactly what her silence was made of. It was made of respect. She had told me 2 years earlier that the paper was waiting. Neither of us said it out loud. The paper had waited. I want to tell you what I did that night, and I want to tell it plainly, because I promised you the truth about the emotional ledger and not just the financial one. I drove home to my little apartment above the laundromat, and I got Notebook 4 down off the shelf, and I opened it to March the 3rd, and I set the printed Tuesday deed next to it on the kitchen table. My mother's shaky signature on one, my own handwriting on the other, 5 years old, dated the same day, describing a confused woman, a doctor's letter, a stranger with a stamp, her sentence and mine, side by side. If you don't write it down, it never happened. She wrote it down. I wrote it down. It happened. And then I went out and sat in my car in the dark of the parking lot, so my neighbors wouldn't have to hear it through the walls. And I cried. Once, hard. For my mother, whose hand was guided to a pen on a day she couldn't hold the date, for 6 years of Sundays. For the girl who overdrew her checking account by $12 and paid for it with a lifetime sentence. It is the only time I cry in this entire story, and Glenn has never seen my eyes wet in his life, and he never will. If you've ever done your crying in a parked car so nobody had to carry it with you, this next part is for you, especially, because the crying was Tuesday night. Wednesday morning, I made coffee, opened a fresh notebook, and wrote 3 words at the top of the first page. Now, the paperwork. If you want to see exactly what a woman who is always bad with money does with a case file, make sure you are subscribed, because everything up to here was what was done to us. Everything after this is what I did back, lawfully, line by line, to the dollar. First, what I did not do, because it matters. I did not call Glenn. I did not post anything. I did not confront, hint, vent, or warn. If 6 years in county records had taught me one thing, it is that the person who talks first loses, and the person who documents first wins. I also did not touch a single record through my job. Everything I gathered as a private citizen from public sources on my own time. I knew, better than almost anyone in Tennessee, by that point, exactly where the line was, and I built my whole case standing 3 feet on the right side of it. What I did do was hire an attorney, a woman in her 60s who had spent 30 years doing elder law, the corner of the law that protects aging people and their money, working out of a converted house near the courthouse with a receptionist who called everyone darling. I sat across her desk on a Thursday morning, and I didn't tell her a story. I handed her a folder. The Tuesday deed, the sale, the doctor's letter with its date, and notebook 4, open to March the 3rd, with a paperclip on the page. She read for 11 minutes without speaking. The same length of time, I noted, that Glenn had talked at his dining table. Then she took her glasses off, set them down, and said, "Mrs. Callahan, do you have more of these notebooks?" "5 of them," I said, 6 years. Every dollar, and most of the days. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "In 30 years, I have had exactly 4 cases walk in the door, already 1. You are the 4th." And she pulled a legal pad toward herself and wrote at the top of the page, in letters I could read upside down, "Callahan v. Fest. Callahan, let me tell you what we filed, in plain words. Because I promised you no law degree would be required. We asked the court for 2 things. 1, to set aside the Tuesday deed. Setting aside means unwinding it, treating it as if it never legally happened, on the grounds that a woman in the first week of a dementia diagnosis, on a documented bad day, steered by the son who controlled her money, cannot meaningfully sign her house away. If the deed falls, then the house was never Glenn's to sell, and the money from the sale belongs to our mother's estate, half of which is mine. 2, a full accounting of every dollar Glenn moved under the power of attorney, because a power of attorney isn't a gift card. The law calls the person holding it a fiduciary, which is a formal word for a simple rule. Her money could only ever be spent on her. Every dollar has to survive that question, and the court can make him answer for all of it. We filed on a Wednesday morning. Glenn was served the papers at his bank, at his desk, on Thursday. I didn't arrange that timing. I just didn't mind it. My phone lit up that night, at 9:40 p.m. I watched his name on the screen until it stopped. Then, a text. "Nora, call me. This is insane." Then a voicemail. I still have. His voice starting warm and ending with an edge, and one sentence in the middle of it that I wrote down in the current notebook. "The way you press a flower," he said. "You don't even understand what you are accusing me of." I understood it to the recorded dollar, but I let the paper answer for me. Because now comes discovery. And this is the part of a lawsuit nobody puts in the movies. And it is where everything broke open. Discovery means each side can lawfully demand the other side's documents. And banks. When a court order arrives, produce statements, going back years. My attorney subpoenaed the records of my mother's accounts for the entire life of the power of attorney. They arrived in boxes. Most people's eyes glaze at boxes of bank statements. I am not most people. I took a week of vacation, and I read every page with a ruler and a pencil, the way I read executors' filings all day. And here is what her own bank records showed. 62 transfers, over 4 years. From June Callahan's savings to accounts belonging to Glenn Callahan. $58,000, moved in slices. 400 here, 900 there. Each one small enough to look like nothing. None of them tied to a single expense of hers. Her savings had never been running low. They had been running out the back door, while I was buying her medicine out of my paycheck and writing it down at her kitchen table. The man telling me the money was tight was standing in the stream with a bucket, and one more thing was in those boxes. And when I found it, I had to set my pencil down and walk around the block. Remember the envelope, the bank letter she held out to me that afternoon, the one Glenn folded into his jacket. The statements told me what it almost certainly was. That month, her savings account had generated an alert for unusual activity. The bank had noticed. She had noticed. She held the proof out to me with her own hand. Nora, look at this. This doesn't seem right. And he took it from her, and he smiled, and he told her not to worry me with it. My notebook entry from that night. Letter from bank, Mama worried. Glenn took it. Now sat next to a bank record confirming exactly why she was worried. 2 pieces of paper, written 5 years apart by people who never compared notes, telling the same story. That, my attorney told me, is what corroboration means, and it is the most beautiful word in the language. Now, the reckoning, and I want to set your expectations, because I know what part of you wants. Part of you wants me to stand up in a courtroom and make a speech while he weeps. I've watched a lot of probate hearings. It never happens. And if it happened, it wouldn't help. What actually happened is better, because it is true, and because I designed it. 14 months into the case, the court ordered mediation. A formal settlement meeting. Both sides, both attorneys, one neutral mediator. A courthouse conference room. Glenn arrived in his best banker's suit with a legal team his own filings later showed was costing him $1,100 an hour. And when he walked in, he looked at me the way you look at a math problem that used to be easy. Halfway through, after his attorneys had spent an hour calling everything a misunderstanding, I asked the mediator for 5 minutes to speak directly. My attorney nodded. She knew. We had written it together and rehearsed it flat. I took out one sheet of paper, and I read to my brother, in the voice I use for reading an audit finding. 7 numbered statements. No adjectives. I'll give them to you. Almost exactly. 1. On the first Monday of that March, a letter diagnosed our mother with vascular dementia. The letter is in evidence. 2. The next day, March the 3rd, she was confused all morning. My phone records show a 9 a.m. call to her. 11 minutes. My notebook entry from that evening is in evidence. 3. That same afternoon, a notary witnessed her signature on a deed, giving you the house. The Tuesday deed is in evidence. 4. Over 4 years holding her power of attorney, you moved $58,000 of her money to yourself in 62 transfers. The bank records are in evidence. 5. 3 weeks after her funeral, you told me the estate was mostly debt and handed me a check for $3,500. I never cashed it. The check is in evidence. 6. How 3 weeks after that, you sold the house for $585,000. The deed is in evidence. 7. I am not here to ask you for anything. The court will do the asking. Then I squared the page against the table, the way Vera squares a page, and I sat back. The room was quiet, in a way that had a texture to it. Glenn looked at his attorneys. His attorneys looked at their pads. And my brother, who had spent his whole life being the one across the desk, said the only unguarded thing he said. In 14 months of litigation, he didn't say, "I am sorry." He didn't say, "It isn't true." He looked at me and said, "You were writing everything down the whole time?" And I said, the last sentence I have ever spoken to my brother, face to face. I said, "You know me, Glenn. I was always bad with money. I had to keep notes." Mediation failed, which is a strange thing to say about the best afternoon of my legal life. His side offered $90,000 that day, then $150,000 a month later, each offer arriving with a paragraph about family and closure. We declined both, politely. In writing, when the number you are owed is written in public records and bank statements. You don't negotiate with it. You wait for it. Paper waits. So did I. The judge's ruling came on a Thursday morning, 4 months after mediation, a written opinion, 31 pages. And I have read all of them more times than I'll admit. I'll give you what it did in plain words in 3 parts. Because it did 3 things. First, the Tuesday deed was set aside, unwound. Oh, and in the eyes of the law, our mother never signed her house to Glenn, which means Glenn sold a house that was never his, which means every dollar of that sale belonged to her estate. The young couple keeps their home. The law protects an innocent buyer, as it should. It is the seller who has to answer for the money. And in the middle of the capacity analysis, the judge did the thing I will carry to my own grave. She quoted Notebook 4. My 39 words about March the 3rd appear, word for word, in a court opinion, followed by a sentence I am going to read you exactly, because I've earned it and so have you. The judge wrote, these contemporaneous ledgers, kept daily and without any apparent motive beyond habit, are the most reliable financial record before this court. The most reliable financial record before this court. 99 cents apiece. Written by the family member who was always bad with money. Somewhere my mother is telling every soul in heaven. I taught her that. Second, the money. The court ordered Glenn to repay what the deed and the power of attorney had let him take. I'll do all the arithmetic for you one last time. Slowly, and then never again. Half of what the house brought after the costs of sale. $280,000. My share as her other heir. Half of what he drained from her accounts and pocketed through the affidavit he swore out on her last small bank account. $38,500. And every dollar in my notebooks, repaid to me with interest as money I'd spent keeping up what was really, the whole time, his collateral. $55,000. Added up, and it comes to $373,500, plus my attorney's fees, which the judge made him pay because of what she called the character of the concealment. But don't hold the number. Hold what the number is. It is every dollar I spent, every dollar she lost, and half of everything he swore to my face didn't exist. Third, and I did not ask for this. The system did it on its own, which made it better. The judge sent one particular document across the street to the district attorney. Early in the case, we'd found that Glenn had also used something called a small estate affidavit, a sworn shortcut that lets a family member collect a dead person's last small bank account, without a judge, by swearing under oath about what the estate contains and who gets a share. He'd sworn it out, collected her final $19,000, and kept it. Swearing falsely on that paper isn't a family matter. It is a crime. I am told he avoided charges by signing an agreement in which he admitted, in writing, every number I just read you. Imagine that. The last document in the file is my brother, under his own signature, finally writing it all down. Mama's rule catches everyone, eventually. Now the consequences, delivered flat, because the flatness is the point. Glenn was a licensed loan officer. A man who approves mortgages cannot carry a public court, finding that he took a house from his own mother, by way of a deed signed in her diagnosis week. His bank's compliance department, the people whose whole job is reading exactly the kind of public records I keep, found the ruling within the month, the same way anyone can. He resigned before they could finish the paperwork. His license lapsed quietly. The following year, the lake house went on the market to cover a judgment, and legal bills his own filings, put near $200,000. I didn't report him to anyone, and I didn't need to. I just made everything true in a place where paperweights and professionals read. He did not go quietly, and I am going to give you this part because your anger has been patient, and it deserves its receipt. In the weeks after the ruling, there were 9 voicemails. There was a 4-page email with the word family 11 times and the word sorry 0 times, informing me that I had torn us apart and that, direct quote, Mom would be ashamed of what you turned this into. I printed it, dated it, filed it, answered nothing. And then, on a Tuesday, it would be a Tuesday, he appeared in the lobby of my building, at the counter of the Register of Deeds, asking for me. Security called up. I came down the stairs, and I stood behind the counter with the public terminal glowing between us. And my brother started to say my name. And I said the last thing I expect I'll ever say to him. I said, "Careful, Glenn. This is a records office. Office. Everything here gets written down." He looked at the counter, and the terminal, and the cameras, and at me. And for 1 second, I watched him finally do the math. Then he left. The whole thing is 4 seconds of security footage. I've never watched it. I don't need to. I was there, and I wrote it down. So, how does it end? Not the way the movies would end it, and I want to be straight with you about that, because you've come this far on the truth. I did not get my family back. There was no reconciliation scene, no holiday table, where everyone finally understood. My brother is alive, 3.5 hours away, and we will likely never speak again. And I have made a full and complete peace with that, because the brother I grieve, the one from before the folder in the hospital room, I am no longer sure ever existed. You cannot be reunited with someone who was never there. That grief is real, and I keep it in its own notebook, so to speak. And I don't pretend it is smaller than it is. But one thread came back to me, and it is the one I'd have chosen. 2 months after the ruling, I got a card in the mail from my niece, Glenn's daughter, 23, away at graduate school through all of this. Inside, in careful handwriting, it said, I read the whole opinion, all 31 pages. I am so sorry, Aunt Nora. Grandma deserved better. And so did you. Can I buy you coffee? We meet once a month now. And here is the detail that undid me. She brings a little notebook. She writes down the books I recommend, the dates we pick, the family recipes I am teaching her out of Mama's tin. I've never once mentioned the notebook's place in this story to her. Some inheritances just find their way downstream. The money did quiet, useful things. I paid off my little brick house in Knoxville. I refilled the retirement I'd emptied. And every March, on the 3rd, a scholarship gets awarded at the community college, where I took my night classes. Full cost of the paralegal program, 1 student a year. Someone starting over, after caregiving. It is named for June Callahan, first recipient, was a 55-year-old man who'd spent 9 years caring for his wife. When they handed him the letter, he did his crying right there in the hallway, and I looked away to give him privacy, and I thought, sir, I did mine in a parking lot, and it is nothing to be ashamed of either way. I kept my job. I love my job. Somewhere in the county there is an executor filing an accounting this week, confident that nobody reads these things closely, and I want him to know that I read everything closely, and I do it for free of charge, on behalf of every heir who was ever told they wouldn't understand the paperwork. And once, exactly once, I drove back down my mother's street in Maryville. It was last October, dusk. That hour, she never let pass without her ritual. I slowed in front of the house her husband built, and her son sold. There were pumpkins on the steps. There was a tricycle tipped over in the yard, and the porch light was on. Somebody else's mother had turned it on for somebody else's people, and I sat there in my car and felt the strangest, cleanest thing. Not loss, relief. The light didn't belong to the house. It never had. It belonged to the woman, and the woman had handed it to me a long time ago. I drove home to Knoxville, and I turned on my own porch light, and it has not been off since, so the ones I love can find the door. My niece has a key. The 5 notebooks sit on a shelf in my kitchen now, next to a 6th one, current, ongoing, because I still write down every dollar. They are the cheapest objects I own, and the most expensive things my brother ever underestimated. For 6 years I thought I was keeping a record of what I was losing. I had it backwards. Page by page at that kitchen table, I was keeping the proof of what I was worth. I just couldn't read my own ledger yet. It took the county, and Vera, and a judge to read it back to me, the most reliable record before this court. That is not about notebooks. That was never about notebooks. My brother told me my whole life that I was always bad with money. I've thought about it, and I've decided he was half right. I never did learn how to take it, but I learned how to read it. I learned how to follow it through 4 years of bank statements with a ruler and a pencil, and how to lay it next to a diagnosis letter and a notary's date, and how to make it tell the truth under oath in a room where his $1,100 an hour attorneys couldn't save him. If that is bad with money, then I hope to God I never get good. That is my story. If one line of it is going to stay with you, tell me which one in the comments. I read them all, usually with coffee, usually with the porch light on. If you were ever the one who stayed, and nobody ever handed you the receipt for it, consider this video your receipt, and subscribe, because there are more of us than anyone knows. And I am not done telling our stories. Write it down. That is all my mother ever asked of anybody. If you don't write it down, it never happened. I wrote it down. It happened.